Dennis, I'll just give these to you here. We're going to be passing around these cards, though, just to let you know. I really want you, but on receiving these cards, though, you must commit yourself to at least using it putting it by your mirror and using it for a month. Would you try that out? Don't take the card if you're not going to do that. Am I a manipulator or what? No, I'm actually trying to convince you to do something that would be an extraordinary thing. Once you begin to, your thoughts with God's thoughts, and His word with your first words with His. And we've been doing this series on knowing God through the attributes of God and how they speak to our lives. And we've looked in our last session together about these themes, about the Omni Attributes of God a couple of weeks ago. And Larry, I'm grateful for your filling in last time. Thank you for that. And so the Omni Attributes of God, the omniscience, His omnipresence, omnipotence, and all these are mentioned as well in Psalm 139. So it's an extraordinary exercise for us to consider the implications of what does it mean that wherever I am, He's always there, always present, always knows me through and through, and is powerful enough to overcome all the obstacles that are allowed in my life because He redeems what He allows. And so that understanding then that God is that robust, your bigger your vision of God, and that's the whole point of this series, the more confidence you have and the less fear you will engage in. You're big God, small problems, small God, big problems. We've talked about that before, but it's a motif that runs through my life, and that's a very important dimension. And now I want to move on we're going to be moving on to the wisdom of God. And if we have time, we'll start, at least begin the transcendence of God. I'm zooming into a few more attributes. We're near the end of this series, but you could go on for a year and on and on. But I want to talk about the wisdom of God in contrast to the wisdom of our own wisdom, the wisdom of man. And because there is such a motif here, I'm not clear why Tozer. It was an odd thing for me when you see he starts about God's and His eternity and His self-sufficiency, and we've talked about that, His infinitude, and then he talks about His immutability, that God does not change, which is an incredibly important theme because my circumstances change, but God does not. So what's the application there? Never view your circumstances, God through the lens of your circumstances, but instead view your circumstances, which are changing, through the lens of God's unchanging character. So it gives you a point of view. So then he talks about the divine omniscience, and then after wisdom he goes to omnipotence, and then after transcendence he talks about omnipresence. I'm not quite clear why he did that, but I changed the order and put them together for you because I like the Omni Attributes. So I want to go backwards then to the wisdom of God. And one of the themes I want us to go to is Daniel chapter 2, because when the secret of the king's dream is revealed to Daniel, he says that he first of all blesses God in heaven. So before he goes to the king, he pauses to thank God for the revelation. And he says, let the name of God be blessed forever and ever, for wisdom and power belong to Him. You see, Nebuchadnezzar was pulling a stunt that had never been seen before. What was this stunt? He had a dream and he wanted the interpretation. No problem, tell us the dream, we'll give you the interpretation. He says, no, you tell me the dream and then I'll know you can understand the interpretation. No one's ever asked that before. And so they began to whine, and effectively everyone was going to lose their lives. And then Daniel prayed for wisdom and God granted him the revelation. So they gave him authority when he went before Nebuchadnezzar. But before he does that, he pauses to thank God. And that's an important motif here. He says wisdom and power belong to Him. He's the one who changes the times and the epochs or the seasons. He's the one who removes kings and establishes kings. And that is a comforting word for our time and all times, is it not? Because we serve a God who is the God who is in control somehow. In spite of our own foolishness and the power of sin and the flesh and the enemy, the devil and his agents and his angels, nevertheless, in spite of that warfare, God is the one who appoints and removes. He could take a person down in a moment. every beat of their heart, of a ruler's heart. How many times did Hitler, for example, escape plots against his life? And there were quite a few that were plus before that, he was in an accident with a truck, and with one more foot and he would have been killed, and much earlier than that. God sovereignly allows it. He allowed Nebuchadnezzar to receive power. And that's where it gives me comfort and wisdom, rather than wringing our hands in despair at the circumstances of this world. We need to go to the God who made all wisdom, and then walk in his wisdom and become like him. So ours is a derivative wisdom. His is the ultimate wisdom. And he says he gives knowledge to men of understanding. He reveals the profound and hidden things. He knows what's in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. So in understanding this, then, it's this idea that nothing less than infinitude that we're trying to express when we're talking about a God who controls history in that manner. It requires the sovereignty and the profound mysteries. There are layers of mystery that God is in control, and yet we still are given the awful dignity of agent causality. You can actually choose to do things. And that God, this is not just kismet or fatalism or some kind of determinism, that you're a player and your choices matter and your prayers matter and your actions matter. And so this is not some fatalistic thing. Yet somehow, on the other hand, the God who controls all things allows that to happen, but ultimately it is going to be part of his purpose. Mysteries within mysteries. But the whole concept of two kinds of wisdom, so ours is a derivative wisdom. He says that all the shining wisdom of men or angels is but a reflection of that uncreated effulgence which streams from the throne of the majesty in the heavens. It's this uncreated thing, and sometimes I try to get my head around this. Why is there something rather than nothing? I ask that odd question, and I give myself a headache when I do, because there's no way of accounting for why God, why anything. And yet, to ask why is to have you're a contingent being who can only think in terms of space and time. And we are not able to account for ourselves. Here's the one whose being and whose essence are one and the same. He's a necessary being. Why God? He always is. And there's never a time when he was not. I can't get my head around that. It's too much. These things are too high, unattainable. I want you to be amazed at God. I want you to be astonished at him, because the more you are, the greater your vision of who he is, the more then you can live with poise and peace and patience and contentment and gratitude in a roiling world with storms all about us, staying in the center of the eye of the hurricane, even though the force, the amplitude of that hurricane is rising, as Jesus told us it would in the last days. In other words, you can still live with poise and peace and patience to manifest the fruit of the Spirit when we embrace God's wisdom. And so that there are two kinds of wisdom that we have, and we have to choose between the wisdom of God and the cunning of Satan and fallen men, as he puts it. And I often contrast the two by looking at the wisdom from above, which is in James chapter 3. And he speaks of that as being pure, it's peaceable, and it has good fruits. But then James wisely contrasts a cunning, a shrewd wisdom from below. And I use 4 C's to describe the wisdom from below. It's cagey. Have you ever known people like this who are caging, conniving, crafty, and cunning? I've been with some people like that, and you realize, my word, they're manipulators and they're good. And they convince people and they bring them under their influence. And it is a wisdom, because you see, Satan doesn't like to grant his gifts very much, but he will reluctantly give them because you need power to convince. And so he will continue to give these people that, although it takes more and more to get less and less, which is the nature of addiction, because you're not getting the source from the one true God. So the wisdom from above, the wisdom from below couldn't be more contrasted, because you see, as you can contrast, one is by sight on the left side, and the wisdom from above is by faith. Law versus grace, flesh versus spirit, our will versus God's will. Resistance versus submission. Autonomy versus dependence, our wisdom and divine wisdom. So when we look at this side and just look at this side of this, to walk by faith, to immerse yourself in the grace and goodness of God, to walk in the power of the Holy Spirit, to seek God's will and not your own will, to submit to that will as actually realizing more and more that whatever He asks for us is always going to be for our highest good, even though we disagree with what that looks like. And so it's the realization, the more you submit to that will of God, the more it becomes more evident to you. And part of that submission is a voluntary obedience to choose the way of trust, even though I do not understand. But as I have often told you, obedience is the portal, the pathway to divine disclosure. And I want you to hear that because it's very important. Obedience. You want to know God better? Do what He calls you to do. Why would He give you more light if you didn't respond to the light you've already got? So He's a perfect pedagogue. He doesn't teach unless you get these certain required courses. You ever had those kinds of things? Required courses. And some are elective, some are required. And as you know, in the University of Life, suffering is not an elective. And so it's a required course, but he then says, how will you approach suffering? Will you try to do it in your own devices and desires and come to me as a last resort? Or will you train yourself so that I become the first resort, the first point of pursuit? So as opposed to this, because your flesh will in fact be on this side. It'll always be resisting his purposes. It'll always seek autonomy. It'll always pursue our foolish wisdom. It'll always go by sight and by law, and you'll notice the wisdom of men is very legalistic indeed. No room for grace, no room for forgiveness. You certainly see this in critical race theory and so forth, where we're victims and you can't be forgiven. It's amazing stuff, no grace in the works of men. So what you have here are cheap, ugly imitations of a greater good. He speaks about wisdom, and as he describes it, it's the ability to devise perfect ends and to achieve those ends by the most perfect means. It sees the end from the beginning. And he says, each in proper relation to all. So the way I would describe it would be, wisdom is the application of knowledge. You know the truth, but now you apply it. But you do it in the right time, for the right reason, in the right amount, for the right purpose, in the right power, you see. And all of those things are person-specific and situation-specific. So there's no simple guidebook to wisdom. Wisdom requires an ongoing dependence on the Holy Spirit. How do I respond to this situation in my life? What biblical principles are there? What history can I develop looking at my past and looking at my present and looking at the future? Embedding my story in God's story gives me a greater capacity for wisdom. So again, you want to add Jesus to your story. Add Him to your past. Add Him to your present. And add Him to your future. Because you see where your past, your present, and your future, He's there. Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, you finish it. Today, yes, and forever or tomorrow. You see, He is the I Am, the beginning and the end, the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last. And in tying all things together then, you have wisdom and knowledge, and He has become for us wisdom and knowledge and righteousness and sanctification. And where does He now live? In you. And you are in Him. You have the fountainhead, the wellspring, the source of the water of life. You see, the fountain of youth, as it were, because you're forever young. Not in this earth suit. That's painfully obvious. I was in Baton Rouge last week, and that's why I wasn't here, meeting and seeing a number of friends that I hadn't seen in 10 years or more. And frankly, it's a sadness to see the diminishment that we all have. And you know how we all always say, oh, you look great, you look marvelous, haven't changed a bit. You liar, you look terrible, and so do I. It was depressing and so forth, but it shouldn't be so. You see, it's like fish wondering about water, but we're immersed in it. Yet we know something's wrong. This isn't the way things were meant to be. We weren't meant to age. We weren't meant to die. We weren't meant to get ill. And ultimately, we won't be. Now, we know that we are in the spiritual places, but still we are anticipating all that return. So wisdom then invites us to apply this in proper association with all things. The wisdom of man is very, very weak in many ways because it's a distortion of the truth of the living God. When I think about Romans chapter 1, and you go back to it, and we've discussed this before, Romans chapter 1, even though they knew God, they didn't honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and they became enslaved to that. It starts with spiritual darkness, a spiritual rebellion against God in verses 18 to 20. They knew it, but they didn't acknowledge it because they wanted to be autonomous. And so they chose to find ways. And men have sought ways of getting rid of the evidence for God, and finally it was found in the 19th century, or so it was supposed. It's an amazing thing. And it led to an intellectual darkness, where people have actually come to believe through Darwinism and basic now neo-Darwinism, where they've added actually mutations and natural selection, a way of trying to account for the obvious evidence of purpose that surrounds us. So that there is an intellectual darkness was produced by a spiritual darkness, which then led to a moral darkness. I'm amazed by this. I'm doing a series right now on Is There Really a God in my Sunday morning class. And so I've just got to this point here where I'm going to do this little section next Sunday. I love this guy. Somebody's got a sense of humor there. So he's pointing to that board there. And you wonder, what about evolution? And I only want to make a couple comments about this because this is tacitly embraced as the vast majority view. And people who reject this are seen as dimwits or Luddites or whatever you might want to call them. Here's the claim in a non-theistic evolutionary model to account for the evidence of design that seems all around us is to say that non-living systems generated life by means of time plus chance. But by the way, you cannot appeal to evolution for biogenesis because you'd have to be alive for there to be mutations in natural selection. And they don't have it. So I don't even have to even get to evolution where it's already a defeater because you can never get a first cell. It's too complex. But we go on in this new mythology because every culture has a mythology. Microevolution, small changes, leads to macroevolution, large changes. I don't doubt that there are certain small changes that occur, but within boundaries. But then this leap of faith without the evidence to support it is amazing. Well, the transitional fossils will be found. This was the assumption in Darwin, but actually turns out that the more fossils that were found, the more it exposed the gap between the transitions. You see, there were no gaps, there were no transitions. So a Cambrian explosion and so forth. But here's the thing I wanted to zoom in on. The philosophical problem, it makes the effects greater than the cause. Would you have a problem with that? Have you ever seen an effect greater than the cause? Let me show you what I mean by that, and we go from here. So here's what you have. The effects that we're looking at are complexity in this world, would you agree? Life in this world, and intelligence in this world, personality. Now, what's the causes? Are you going to tell me then, and this is what it's claiming, that disorder produces complexity, non-life leads to life, that random interactions and mutations lead to intelligence, and that impersonal events produces personality? Would you not say that's a strange pill to swallow? Have you ever known an effect to be greater than the cause? But my digression, here endeth that digression. So we're up to here now. So I'm just saying that when we're looking at wisdom, we're looking at resting in what God is and what he reveals to us and shows to us. And we are living in a world of beauty and wisdom and the wisdom of God, even though fallen. I continue to be astonished by the new things I keep discovering in the natural world. And the more we discover, the thinner that account is, you see. But men in their hearts want to disbelieve in God because they do not want to be accountable. They want to be autonomous. It's our natural thing. Even as believers, we have the struggle, as you know, between the inner and the outer, between the flesh and the spirit. We know that. And that's why I hope that you're using the Lord's Prayer slowly at the beginning of the day. Dallas Willard had that practice, and it was an interesting one. And I find that I have a certain routine that I use on a daily basis, and it includes the, just to let you know where I am, because without these things, I can lose my grounding. So I always start with this before rising to bed card here. Now we have cards for you. Take them, please, and use them. Put this next to your bed and make this something, especially trust the Father, abide in the Son, walk by the Spirit. And then the other card that you're getting, and please take one of these cards here for life-changing prayers. I want you to have the aspiration that these prayers invite us to pursue. They invite us to have a heart of wisdom and knowledge of the living God. And so in understanding that then, the wisdom of God gives us a perspective, a point of view, an understanding that the world cannot at all provide. It is a way of understanding. And this wisdom of God is also based upon the fear of God and the awareness of His greatness. So he speaks about the wisdom of God. The operation of the gospel comes from the wisdom of God, which is greater than the folly of men. The new birth is out of the wisdom of God. The coming of the divine spirit into human nature, the ultimate overthrow of evil, and the final establishment of Christ's righteous kingdom. This is the wisdom of God to which we must follow. And He constantly spreads around us providential circumstances that work for our present good and our everlasting well-being. And I want you to hear that because it's so critical. When I see a thing that that doesn't seem to fit as a good thing, I need to reinterpret that. God, if He's allowing this in my life, has it there for a reason. And my task is to align my will, my imagination, my purposes with His by renewing my mind and believing, as I said before, that if God redeems what He allows, what I construe to be an evil thing will ultimately be used for good. Who's the one who gets to make that decision? So I always know, through a long history of experience, that you yourself can look back to and consistently find it's true, that whenever there's a disagreement between you and God, who's going to win? The reality is, who's going to be right? Why would I push back against the one who actually loves me? And here's the point. He loved us. Repudiating our own wisdom is what we need to do in order to embrace His. And that's why He says, God constantly encourages us to trust Him in the dark. That's very critical. Trust Him in the dark with what He's allowing to happen in the light. And so He says, with the goodness of God to desire our highest welfare, the wisdom of God to plan it, and the power of God to achieve it, what do we lack? So I want you to think about that. The goodness of God, He desires your greatest welfare. It's a steady intention of His desire for your best good. And that His wisdom of God is able to plan it. I have plans for you. And that the power of God actually will pull it off. It's not just a matter of theory. He will bring about what He promises. Then we lack nothing if we consider it that way. So consider it from this standpoint here. I'm going to ask you this question. We'll look at the transcendence and another attribute next time. But what do you think about the wisdom of God as being the implications of that? And contrasting that with your own wisdom. And so I'd like you to process that together around your tables. Okay. What thoughts and questions did you have? And I did forget to mention, 2 weeks ago, I gave you an exercise, didn't I, about writing this verse on your card? Remember that? Any of you? I hope you. I'm not going to ask for hands, although guilt and shame are my friends. But I will restrain myself and just say, this is my own handwriting. Put it on a 3x5 card. You remember those, and I carry it with me because it's my reminder every time I grab my iPhone. I feel that thing. You see, it's right there, and it's in my handwriting. And of course, it's finding whatever is true, whatever is right, whatever is honorable, whatever is pure, whatever is good repute. If there is anything excellent and worthy of praise, what are you supposed to do? Dwell, which means then, what am I thinking about? When my mind goes to neutral? That's why my suggestion is to pull this thing out And I mentioned it, when to do that. When might you do that? When you're waiting at, especially when you get fresh bread, you got to, what that is, think of that as not an annoyance, but an interruption, but an invitation to a mini Sabbath between you and God. You're going to be there anyway. Instead of fuming, man, I'm late. No, pull this thing out and focus on, and after a while, you'll train your mind by habituation. This is part of what wisdom is involved in, the habituation of practices through training. Remember, skill, which is what wisdom is. The major image of chokhmah, then, is skill. And I define wisdom as skill in the art of living in such a way that each aspect of your life is under the lordship of the living God. You see, the fear of the Lord, the awe of God, and understanding His glory and His greatness. The bigger He is, then the smaller your problems. So pull this thing out and check out. So when you're at a light, where else? What else? When other time would you bring this in?
We discussed at our table again about chaos.
Okay. Well, hold that thought then. So I would also say when you're online, we do that a lot, and when you're in traffic. I mean, we have a lot of times that we're dead times. So please take this opportunity to make that part of your thinking, because and I'm doing this. I feel like a parent that's saying you really ought to eat these things because they're good for you, but I feel a pushback nevertheless. Johnny doesn't want his spinach, and so then we'll go to your.
Just around our table, we discussed the chaos that we're experiencing in the world today.
Yeah, the chaos. Mm-hmm.
Particularly the foundation of our humanity. That is, foundationally, if you don't know whether you're a man or you're a woman, you're in real trouble.
Yeah, the foundation of what it is to be a human being. What is it to be? What is masculinity and femininity and this sort of thing? Yes.
We know that God is not the author of confusion.
Right.
So that's who is doing it.
Yes. So yeah. So going back to the wellspring of wisdom, and once again, is your wisdom then going to be based upon? You have a choice, and every decision is going to be either based on His wisdom or the world's wisdom. And it's easy to get into the trap of compartmentalizing your life in such a way that you'll make certain decisions with God in mind and certain decisions that ignore Him, and that you ignore Him to your peril. So all things matter, and having a unifying force that invites us to see that is, I think, very essential for us to have that perspective. There was a question over here.
Well, it's not a question so much as the timing. I think is a good time to review memory verses is right before you go into any sort of confrontation.
That's a good word.
Employee, employer, whether it's a witness opportunity, whether it's a problem with a neighbor, to know you're going to have some sort of meeting like that, to review memory verses ahead of time, remember who it is you're representing, makes for a much better outcome than going in with your own agenda.
Yes, I hope you all heard that.
I don't understand why we don't call constantly, you're right, on God for the power of the Holy Spirit that's in us before every meeting, every decision. We don't plug into that power.
See, that's training, to train yourself, to habituate yourself to where that becomes your automatic response. And rather than a secondary impulse, you want to do it in such a way that you train yourself. It's not trying, remember, it's training. And that's how you develop a skill. And that's what wisdom is. So that you only have two options, the wisdom of man and the wisdom of God. And how does the former work out for you? How's that working for you? You've never regretted following the wisdom of God. So training that and making that your milieu, the way in which you think. And that's why Tozer, as you can see up here, is actually telling us the goodness of God to desire our highest welfare, the wisdom of God to plan it, and the power of God to achieve it. That's a pretty powerful combination. And if I go to a meeting, and as you rightly say, I have to have certain texts in my mind that relate to this. And whatever is true, the Philippians 4 wouldn't be a bad one, but there'd be others as well, speaking the truth in love, and a number of things. That whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to Him, to God the Father. And to be humble, and to be other-centered and Christ-like, and to forgive one another, just as God in Christ has also forgiven you. Certain things that you bring to prepare yourself, because when there's a potential for antagonism, you then really want to walk with the weapons of the Spirit, which is love, joy, and peace, not the deeds of the flesh. So that's part of what wisdom's about.
You know, Ken, we're all children of God. We're told in Proverbs that we need to train up in the child the way she should go.
Mm-hmm.
Training in the ways of the Lord is a continuous thing. In the 5th or 6th chapter of Daniel, in this chapter 2, Darius mentioned that Daniel was a continuous servant twice. Now, Darius wasn't a Christian, but he observed Daniel's behavior in such a way that he knew he walked with God.
Yes.
Because the way he lived, he knew he walked with God. And that's what we want to live in such a way that people know that we worship the living God.
Yes. So it's a walking with God. And what's the best sphere that you've been granted in which you can manifest eternal values in the temporal arena? Is it not the marketplace? Is it not the work arena? And that's the thing that most men who are followers of Jesus have not really connected with their actual vitality in Christ. And that's a compartmentalized life. No, your work is your worship if it's done to the glory of God. Whatever you do to the glory of God. So if it's done as unto the Lord, then you now have been given a sphere of influence and credibility, especially if you do your work with excellence and skill. Let the work point beyond itself. So you have now a credibility and an authority because you're a man of your word. How rare is that? A man of integrity, whose word is his bond, and whose excellence is going to be, even if you do not do what he wants him to do, you don't look to him. You don't look to others as your source. They're a means. So now you have a theater in which you play those attributes out, and people see the life of Christ in you. And that's a powerful word for you. So take it seriously, and as Herb was saying, you make decisions and business decisions to your peril, unless you bring them under the authority of the principles of the Word of God, and in certain cases seek God's counsel through the collective and corporate judgment, because in the collective we have a greater wisdom. So when you're making decisions, it's wise to, when you're not certain about a thing, to call in that collective wisdom so that there's a greater collective mind, so that it's not just an individualistic thing, but it's an interdependent thing. But when we do this, it makes an incredible difference. Yeah. What last thought? Because these are, yes.
I think it's, for me, it's just a matter of trust.
Trust.
I feel like that me and personally, it's almost like I'm on a journey. I'm sitting in this car with God. And I've got to be able to trust him to get my hands off the steering wheel and allow him to take control.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing because we're called to grow in trust, and what was previously a risky thing, yesterday's faith, becomes today's sight. So he's going to keep bumping up the ante of risk as you actually apply. Then to keep you growing requires more risk, you see, and that's how it is. But actually the risk is always, whenever you obey him, you never regret it. But it's not static. You want to continue to press on into the higher calling of the living God, further up and further in.